The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It fell in long silver curtains across the moors of Ashford, drowning the last roses of October and turning the gravel paths of Hawthorne Manor into rivers of gray stone and shadow. Inside, the manor breathed with a quiet so particular it could only be called deliberate, not the silence of peace, but the silence of things carefully suppressed. Fires burned in the parlors below. Crystal sang against crystal at Eleanor Hawthorne's evening table, and above it all, 5 floors and a locked door away from the warmth, Isabella Hawthorne sat beneath a single candle and listened to the rain as though it were the only voice in the world still willing to speak to her. She was 18 years old. She had been beautiful once, still was, though she had forgotten it. Her dark hair had grown long and tangled without anyone to help her dress it, and her dress, a pale ivory muslin she had worn since summer, had turned the color of old paper at the hem. There were ink stains on her fingers, permanent as tattoos. She kept 2 candles, rationed carefully, and when she could not afford the light, she sat in the dark and thought. There was much to think about. There was nothing but thinking. Her father had died in June. The memory of it was still a wound she could not bring herself to examine directly, only at angles, the way one looks at a flame to understand its shape without being burned. Lord Edmund Hawthorne had been a gentle man, a scholar, a collector of old maps and older books, and he had loved his daughter with the uncomplicated, abiding tenderness of a man who had known grief early and refused to let it harden him. He had taught Isabella Latin and astronomy. He had held her hand through thunderstorms when she was small, whispering the names of constellations until the lightning seemed less like violence and more like theater. Then he had married Eleanor Pemberton 4 years after her mother's death, and everything had begun its slow, almost imperceptible unraveling. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Eleanor Hawthorne was not a monster of the obvious kind. She was elegant and composed, possessed of a beauty that had been calculated and maintained across 40 years with the dedication of an engineer. She smiled often. She spoke well. She had, in their early years as a household, been what society called a reasonable stepmother, which is to say she had been pleasant in company and merely cold in private. Isabella had not hated her. She had simply learned the geography of the woman, which rooms to avoid, which topics to leave unspoken, how to exist in the same house without requiring anything of her that warmth might demand. But when Edmund died quietly in his sleep, of a heart that had worked hard and long and finally rested, something in Eleanor shifted like a season changing. The lawyers came. The papers were read, and it emerged with a terrible clarity that Edmund had left the greater portion of his estate to Isabella, the house, the land, the income from 3 small but reliable properties in Derbyshire, and a trust that would pass to his daughter upon her 21st birthday. Eleanor received a generous widow's settlement. Generous, but not controlling. Within a fortnight, Isabella had been moved to the attic. It was done with the efficiency of a woman who had spent her marriage preparing for this contingency. A letter was composed and sent to every household of consequence in 3 counties. Miss Isabella Hawthorne had been sent to a restorative retreat on the continent following a nervous collapse brought on by grief. The doctors had insisted on isolation. Isabella's personal maid, a girl named Ruth, who had wept openly when they parted, was dismissed with a good reference and no forwarding address, and the attic door was fitted with a new lock, the key for which hung upon Eleanor's chatelaine, with the keys to the wine cellar and the silver cabinet, as though they were all of equal value. The attic was not, strictly speaking, unlivable. That was the cruelest thing about it. It had a small window, a cot, a washstand. It was merely a place from which a life could not be lived. The window looked out over the North Meadow, and in the far distance, the gray smudge of the village, which might as well have been the moon for all Isabella could reach it. She had found a loose floorboard in her 2nd week. Beneath it, left by some forgotten servant of another century, were 3 things: a stub of pencil, a small journal with half its pages remaining, and a hardened tallow candle. She had wept over these objects with a gratitude that frightened her by its intensity. She began to write. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The poems came first, because poetry is what the mind produces when it is alone with large feelings and limited paper. She wrote about her father, the way it smelled of pipe tobacco and old vellum, the specific quality of his laughter. She wrote about the garden below, which Eleanor had already altered. She wrote about the color of the moors in October, which no one had asked her to describe, and which she described with the precision of love. Then, as October deepened and the cold became a presence rather than a quality of air, she began to write differently. The poems became less about the world outside and more about the world inside herself, the landscape of longing, the strange topography of grief, the way hope does not extinguish itself even when all the reasonable arguments have been made against it. On the 18th of October, with the rain coming down in earnest, Isabella sat for a very long time with the pencil in her hand and did not write. She sat and listened to the wind against the window frame and felt, with a completeness that was almost peaceful, the full weight of her isolation. She was alone. She was forgotten. She was imprisoned by a woman who stood to benefit greatly from her remaining here until she could be managed into signing away what was rightfully hers. No one was coming. No one knew. And yet she found the pencil moving across the page, and she found herself writing not a poem but a letter to the man who still believes in kindness. I do not know if you exist. I have spent 3 months in a room where no one speaks to me, and I have begun to wonder if the world I remember, the world of warmth and decency and the specific mercy of being known, was something I invented. Perhaps I am foolish to write to you. Perhaps you are a fiction I am sustaining, because the alternative is to admit there is nothing sustaining me. But I will write to you anyway. I will write as though you are real, because I find I cannot function on the assumption that you are not. My name is Isabella. I am 18 years old. I am the daughter of a man who was good, and I am imprisoned in the house he left me by a woman who believes that property is worth more than persons. She may be right about the world as it is. I believe she is wrong about the world as it ought to be. I am lonely in a way I did not know was possible. I have thought carefully about the word. Lonely is not merely the absence of company. Lonely is the presence of everything you want to say and no one to say it to. It is the feeling of holding something beautiful, a line of poetry, a sudden thought, the particular quality of rain on glass at night, and having no hands to pass it to. I have so many things to pass, and nowhere to pass them. I was betrayed. I say it plainly, because I find I have no patience left for euphemism. The woman who took my father's name has taken my freedom, my inheritance, and my place in the world, and has told everyone who might look for me that I am elsewhere. I want to be loved. I say that without shame, because what is there to be ashamed of? Every creature wants it. I want to be loved not for my inheritance or my face or my usefulness to someone's ambition, but for the particular shape of my mind, for the way I think, for the things that make me more myself and less like everyone else. I believe you exist. I believe somewhere in England there's a man who still knows how to be kind, who still believes that gentleness is not weakness, and that protecting something fragile is not the same as controlling it. I believe in you because I cannot afford not to. If you find this letter, please know that whoever wrote it was real, and alive, and hopeful. Yours, from a window in the dark, Isabel. She folded the letter 4 times, as small as it would go. She went to the window. The rain hit her face like cold hands. She held the letter out for a moment, a white square against the black October night, and then she let it go. She watched it tumble and catch the wind, spinning in the column of warm air that rose from the drawing-room chimney below, growing smaller and then invisible against the dark. She closed the window. She sat down on the cot. She did not allow herself to think about what she had done, because thinking about it would reveal it as what it was, an act of pure, irrational hope. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Duke Adrian Blackwood had not intended to walk the north meadow of Ashford in the rain. His horse had thrown a shoe on the north road, and he had walked a quarter-mile to the meadow's edge to wait out the worst of the downpour under the old beech stand, because he was a man who preferred movement to stillness, and had never fully accepted that weather was not negotiable. He was 31. He had the reputation of a man for whom reputation has been both entirely deserved and entirely beside the point. He was powerful in the way that old money and older land make a man powerful, not through effort or performance, but through a kind of geological fact. He was not unkind. He was simply closed, in the manner of a house in which a grief has occurred, and the shutters have been drawn, and no one has yet made the decision to open them again. He had loved a woman once. She had died of a fever 3 years ago, a week before they were to marry. He had not discussed this with anyone since the funeral. He was standing under the beeches, watching the rain, when a gust threw a small white square of paper against his boot. He looked down at it. It was folded and soaked on the outside, but the inner layers were still legible, the pencil smeared but intact. He held it close to his eyes in the failing gray light, and began to read. He read it 3 times, standing in the rain. He did not have a name for what happened to him, but he stood there long after the light had gone too gray for reading, with the letter pressed inside his coat against his chest, and he was aware of something shifting in the precise sealed structure he had made of himself, not breaking, but moving, the way ice moves before it melts, in slow and almost silent progressions. I want to be loved not for my inheritance or my face or my usefulness to someone's ambition, but for the particular shape of my mind. He had known a person once who had said something like that. He had not thought about that conviction in 3 years. He had not been able to afford it. He returned to Blackwood Hall. He placed the letter on the desk. He looked at it for a long time. Then he began, with the quiet and methodical thoroughness that was his most dangerous quality, to find out where it had come from. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was not difficult to narrow down the estate. The north meadow of Ashford lay between only 2 properties, the Trevelyan land, which he knew well, and Hawthorne Manor, which belonged to the late Lord Edmund Hawthorne, and was now managed by his widow. He had heard the story about the daughter. A collapse, they said. The continent. Poor girl. The story did not satisfy him. He found himself cataloging inconsistencies, with the same brain that cataloged inconsistencies in contracts and land surveys. A girl who writes like this, with this precision, this rawness, this intelligence, does not simply disappear into a continental retreat and cease entirely from the world's awareness. He presented himself at Hawthorne Manor on the pretext of a drainage survey. Eleanor received him in the blue parlor with the polished efficiency of a woman who had been beautiful and knew how to be charming. She mentioned Isabella twice, the poor darling, quite unwell. The Swiss air was doing wonders, and each time she mentioned her, Adrian watched her eyes, which did not match her mouth. The eyes were watchful, calculating, not the eyes of a woman recounting a grief, but the eyes of a woman managing a story. He observed the servants. The butler met his eyes calmly enough, but there was a young footman by the door who had gone very still when Eleanor said Isabella's name, and a housemaid who had pressed herself against the wall and stared at the floor with the specific blankness of someone concentrating very hard on not reacting. He drank his tea. He discussed drainage. He took his leave. That evening he wrote to his solicitor in London, instructing him to retrieve all documentation pertaining to the estate of the late Lord Edmund Hawthorne. Within 4 days, a girl named Ruth appeared at the servants' entrance of Blackwood Hall. She had been crying before she arrived. She cried considerably more before she left, and Adrian Blackwood, sitting after she had gone with his hands flat on his desk, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Purpose. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He came on the night of the 28th of October. Isabella had been awake. She heard footsteps on the attic stairs at approximately 2 in the morning. Slow, heavy but careful, as though the person making them was trying to be quiet, without having had much practice at it. They paused twice on the stairs. They stood outside the door for a long moment. The lock turned. What happened first was the light. She had been sitting in almost total dark, and the door brought with it the light of the corridor lamp, which fell through the doorway like something solid, like a substance she had forgotten existed in such quantities. She shielded her eyes. She stood, and then she looked. He was tall, forced to bend his head beneath the attic's low beams. He was looking at her, not the way Eleanor looked at her, as a problem requiring management, but in the way a man looks at something that has stopped him mid-thought. He looked at her as though he was recalibrating something. The silence between them had a texture. It was not empty. It was the silence of two people who have already been in correspondence, who know something true about each other, meeting for the first time with that truth between them. He spoke first, keeping his voice low, as though instinctively protecting the moment from being shattered by volume. Miss Hawthorne, I apologize for the hour. My name is Adrian Blackwood. I believe I found something that belongs to you. He reached into his coat. He produced, folded in its original 4 creases, a small square of paper that she recognized by its size and shape before she could even see the writing on it. She sat down, not with grace. She simply sat, because her legs had made the decision independently. You found it, she said. It was not a question. He crossed the room and crouched so that he was at her level, because he seemed to understand, without being told, that standing over her in that moment was the wrong thing to do. He held the letter out to her. She took it. She looked at him. How long? She said, and found she could not finish. He finished it for her. 4 days since I read it. 20 minutes since I had the means to act. You came at night. I did not think Mrs. Hawthorne would let me up the stairs in daylight. The simplicity of it, the flat, factual acknowledgement of what had been done to her, without euphemism, undid something in her chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Her eyes filled. She held very still. Are you cold? He asked. She was, in fact, extremely cold. She had been cold for months in ways that had passed from sensation into climate. He was already removing his coat. He settled it around her shoulders, without ceremony, without making it a gesture. It was simply something that needed doing, and so he did it. The coat was heavy and warm, and smelled of rain and wood smoke, and something she could not name, but which registered in her body as safe. She pulled it close. Thank you, she said. Your father's will is unambiguous, he said, sitting at the edge of the cot, maintaining a careful distance. The estate, the trust, the Derbyshire properties, all yours. What Mrs. Hawthorne has done here constitutes false imprisonment, and I intend to pursue that matter through every available channel. She told everyone I was ill. Abroad. She told them. I intend to tell them differently. Why? It was the most important question, and she asked it without softening. He looked at her directly, the look of someone who has decided something and is explaining it for the first time. Because you wrote to me, and because what you wrote was true, and because I have spent 3 years functioning in a world where truth is a courtesy rather than a requirement, and I am. He stopped, started again. I am tired of it, he said, simply, like a man setting something down. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He did not take her from the house that night. He was meticulous about what was required, propriety, documentation, witnesses. Within 48 hours, a solicitor was at Hawthorne Manor. Within 72, Eleanor Hawthorne was presented with a legal document that had the texture and implications of a wall. She signed what she was required to sign. She did not ask to see Isabella. Isabella came down the attic stairs on the morning of October 30th, carrying only the journal and 3 sheets of paper on which she had written things she did not want to leave behind. The housekeeper met her at the bottom with a glass of warm milk. The young footman, who had gone still at the mention of her name, was standing in the corridor. He met her eyes and gave her a brief, emphatic nod. Adrian was waiting in the entrance hall. "Your house," he said, "is being returned to you." "I don't want it yet," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it. The house was full of Eleanor and months of silence. She needed to want it again, and that would take time. "My solicitor has arranged for you to stay with his sister in the village. She is expecting you. She is kind, and she will not ask you to perform being well before you are." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. "You have thought about this very carefully." "I have thought about little else for 4 days." She took a step toward the door. He opened it. Outside, October had cleared briefly. One of those revelations of autumn, whether where the sky suddenly remembers what blue was. The light hit the gravel path and the clipped yew hedges, and Isabella stood on the threshold and breathed. Just breathed. The cold, the light, the open air, the particular experience of space after its absence. Without thinking, she put her hand on the door frame to steady herself. His hand was already there. Her fingers landed on his. They both went very still. She did not move her hand, nor did he. They stood there in the doorway of the house she owned, in the October light, and neither of them spoke, because what was happening did not require speaking. She moved her fingers, slightly, against his. He turned his hand, slowly, so that his palm was upward under hers. It was not a grip. It was an offer. She accepted it for exactly the time it took her to feel steady on her feet. And then she stepped forward into the light, and he followed a step behind, as though he was already learning the distance she needed. The weeks that followed had the quality of convalescence, not dramatic recovery, but the slow and uneven return of things. She slept, for the first few days, more than she had thought possible. She ate with a gratitude that embarrassed her and eventually stopped embarrassing her. She sat by the window of the solicitor's sister's cottage, a kind, brisk woman named Mrs. Alderton, who indeed did not ask her to perform anything, and watched the village go about its business and felt, gradually, like a person who existed in the world rather than above it. Adrian came. He came correctly, with Mrs. Alderton present, and he brought books, not chosen at random but selected with obvious thought. A volume of poetry she had mentioned in the letter, a natural history, a novel he said he had found unexpectedly good and did not want to recommend formally in case he was wrong about her tastes. She read them all and told him precisely where he had been right and where he had miscalculated, and these conversations lasted longer than visits of that nature were strictly designed to last. He was surprisingly good at presence. For a man with a reputation for coldness, he was attentive in ways that were not performed, quiet attentiveness, the kind that notices without announcing itself. He noticed when she was tired and shortened the visit. He noticed when she was engaged and did not cut it off for propriety's sake. He brought her a pair of gloves when she mentioned her hands were cold, without making the gesture into anything more than it was. She went back to Hawthorne Manor in November. She walked through the room slowly, not with the grief she had expected, but with a different feeling, less like reclaiming a wound and more like acquiring a history. She stood in the library for a long time, touching the spines of her father's books, and felt him very present in this room in the way that the dead sometimes are in the places they loved best. She set the journal on his desk. She thought, I will not burn it. Let Agnes's linen accounts and my desperate poetry exist together in the same binding. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was the 15th of December. Adrian came for dinner. Mrs. Alderton was there, because propriety required a chaperone, and Mrs. Alderton had become fond of the situation in the way that people become fond of stories they feel they have contributed to. They ate well and talked about books and the county road improvement bill and a satirical play that had recently caused controversy in London, and then Mrs. Alderton mentioned she was tired and excused herself, with the particular deliberateness of a woman performing exhaustion she does not entirely feel. Isabella went to the window. Outside, the December night was clear, a hard frost, the stars very sharp and numerous above the dark meadow. She could see, at the meadow's far edge, the beach stand where she supposed he had been standing when he found the letter. She had not spoken about this directly. She did so now. I have wondered, sometimes, what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night, if someone else had found it, or no one. He came to stand beside her at the window, not close, still that careful distance, but present as weather. I have wondered the same thing, he said. And he was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she had come to recognize as thinking rather than reluctance. I think the horse losing its shoe was not an accident. I think the rain, and the direction of the wind, and the precise hour at which you let that letter go. I think these things conspired in the way that certain things conspire that we do not have words for because we have been taught to be suspicious of the words we have. She turned to look at him. He was looking out the window still, at the frozen meadow, the cold stars. You believe in providence. I believe in pattern. I believe that some connections are not made by accident. I am not certain of the mechanism. I am very certain of the result. You said in the attic that you were tired of it, she said. Yes. Of what exactly? He turned from the window then, and faced her, and she understood this was a decision. The turning, the willingness to be looked at saying something real, of being a person without interiority, of managing everything competently, and feeling nothing that I could not justify functionally. I lost someone 3 years ago, and I dealt with it by becoming very effective at everything that was not grief, and I thought this was a reasonable solution, and it was not. She said nothing. She let it be there. Your letter, he said, did something that nothing in 3 years had managed. It made me feel identified, as though the person who wrote it could see the shape of what I was, which I had not allowed anyone near enough to see. You wrote about wanting to be known for the particular shape of your mind. I read that and I thought, yes, that is what I have wanted. That is what I have refused to want because wanting it required opening something I had closed. The candles on the mantel burned steadily in the still air. She felt very precisely located in this room, in this moment, present in a way she had not been fully present since before the attic, as though she had been returned to herself by degrees over these weeks, and had only now arrived completely. You saved me, she said. You saved me first, he said. No hesitation. Entirely level. She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. I did not find your letter by accident, he said, and his voice had the quality of something that has been decided quietly and long, and is being said for the first time. I believe I was meant to find you. The fireside. The candles held their light. Outside, the frost deepened across the meadow, and the stars were very clear, and in the library of Hawthorne Manor, a journal sat on a desk with its impossible pages, Agnes's accounting of small faithful work, and Isabella's months of stubborn, irrational hope, keeping its record of the fact that certain things are not made by accident, and certain letters, sent into the dark on the chance that someone somewhere still believes in kindness, are not sent in vain. She reached out, not for his hand, not quite yet, but toward the space between them, which had always been the real subject of everything. He met her halfway, as he always had. She understood then, from the very beginning, not with rescue, not with possession, but with the patient, careful presence of someone who had also been waiting, in his own closed room, for the specific person who could open it. There were no words for what remained, only the light and the warmth and the long and tender beginning of everything.